Normally, I'd give an elaborate intro before diving into the main topic of the video, but Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite's infamous nature means it doesn't need a formal introduction. Released in late 2017 for the PS4, PC, and Xbox One, the sixth entry into the larger Marvel vs. Capcom series was, after a series of rumours had emerged, announced in late 2016 at Sony's PlayStation Experience event. Fans of the series like myself were extremely hyped for Infinite, as it meant that the series would not be ending with 2011's Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Due to the nature of the series in general, a new entry is never guaranteed due to licensing issues and legal jargon which I won't get into, so having a brand new game for next-gen consoles be officially announced was a dream come true. It's certainly no surprise that Marvel Infinite has had a rocky reception pre- and post-launch, so I won't tell you what you already know. Chun-Li's face, the weird-looking character models, you already know about that I'm sure. Instead, I'll be returning to the game all these years later to document my thoughts and how I feel about it as a die-hard fan of Marvel vs. Capcom. As of recording for this video, it's been 7 years since this game came out, and as I bought my copy on launch day, I've pretty much been here from the beginning. I remember playing the story mode demo and hearing about people's experiences seeing the game at EVO 2017, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on it. I was counting down the days to release as a kid and trying to find as much information online as possible. However, the astronomical hype surrounding Marvel Infinite slowly died out as the game was getting closer and closer to releasing. In the competitive scene of the die-hard fighting game players, Infinite never got as popular as Marvel vs. Capcom 2 or 3, and on the casual side of things, yeah, the casuals didn't seem to appreciate it either, as the game ended up underperforming in terms of sales. But look, we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite introduced plenty of brand new gameplay features, but it also removed lots of key elements to the series that fans had been taken for granted. So let's dive into the game proper and revisit it, shall we? This is Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, over 7 years since it was released. Before we talk about the gameplay, let's immediately address the elephant in the room. No, not Dante and Chun-Li's faces, but the overall character roster. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite launched with 30 characters, with 6 more being released later as DLC. Going back to Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2 for a moment, these games were released in 1998 and 2000 respectively, so when it came to the Marvel side of the roster, they focused more on the comic book part of Marvel's brand. Marvel Infinite does the inverse of this, because instead of focusing on fan favourite characters, as well as including some lesser known characters here and there like MODOK, X-23, Iron Fist, etc., it went all out on promoting the MCU. Marvel movies and TV shows are in a bit of a slump nowadays as superhero fatigue has set in with audiences, but as I'm sure you can remember in 2017, the MCU was massive. Avengers Infinity War was only a few months away from being released and people were hyped. As a business decision, it makes sense why Marvel would have wanted Marvel Infinite to act as a promotion for their films, and I think there are only a few characters in the game who don't belong to the MCU or the Spider-Man related films created by Sony. Returning characters like Frank West, Hagar, and Chris, for example, received lots of new moves and strategies that changed their gameplay, so it's not like that Capcom just ported characters from previous games into Infinite and called it a day. The character select screen itself was a major turn-off for some, as the low quality graphics and unevenness of the screen itself couldn't be ignored. Marvel vs. Capcom 1 also has an uneven roster with 7 Marvel characters and 8 Capcom characters, but you don't notice it because of how the screen is structured. I understand that harping on about the character roster, especially in 2024 as of recording this, may seem like a low blow, but you have to remember that we eat with our eyes first, meaning that if something looks out of place and crude due to incompetency, people's first instincts won't be positive. But look, I don't like being too negative, so I will give Marvel Infinite one thing about its character roster. It does contain a lot of beloved characters, and they have all received new moves. Dante, for example, is one of my mains in both Marvel 3 and Infinite, and he feels very different when compared to Marvel 3. While some of his special moves were removed, how he chains them together is completely different, and his Marvel Infinite combos and movement are totally distinct from Marvel 3. The DLC characters include Black Panther, Black Widow, Winter Soldier, Monster Hunter, Venom, and Sigma, and these characters appear in the game's story mode. I won't cover it in excruciating detail, but it concerns Ultron and Sigma forming like Voltron to create a new being called Ultron Sigma, very creative. Thus, the heroes from the Marvel and Capcom universes must team up to put an end to this evil once and for all. As the DLC characters appear in the story mode and are fully voice acted, it was rumored that all 6 of them were meant to be in the game from the very start, but were later sold as DLC in an attempt by Capcom to make some more money before they stopped supporting the game, and an article by the website Heavy goes into more detail. In fact, much of Infinite's content was made using pre-existing internal assets. Many of the models, including much of the roster on the Capcom side, had their character models and other assets brought over from Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Little to no changes were made to the recycled assets. Artists were told to simply alter the shaders for the new art style with only minor tweaks made to make them work. The sources were very concerned about how little was being spent on the game, with some describing it as a shoestring budget. However, their management saw no problems with it at all, and they ignored concerns from developers. Higher-ups only started to take notice when fans started deriding the graphics on social media and forums. People making fun of Chun-Li's appearance is said to have played a big role in this, causing management to intervene and have part of the game touched up in time for release. For starters, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite's gameplay reverts to an older, more nostalgic form. The 3v3 format introduced in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is gone, and it's been replaced by the 2v2 nature of Marvel 1 and X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The controls are also lifted from Marvel 2, with 2 punches and 2 kicks for a total of 4 primary attack buttons. You can chain these normals together to start combos, and by incorporating specials and supers, you can do some big damage. Another major change, albeit a more controversial one, was the removal of assists. Instead of pressing your partner button for them to come out and help you out with a quick attack, Marvel Infinite features the active switch system, meaning you can press the partner button to tag them in. You can do this whenever you want, provided you aren't being hit, and this mechanic leads to a very free-form and creative combo system. If you've ever wanted to tag your partner in while being in the air, you can do just that in Marvel Infinite. While I personally prefer the assist system due to its limitations encouraging players to think outside the box and use assists to cover the weaknesses of their point character, I can't deny that the active switch system is still very fun and provides players with lots of creative ways to approach the enemy. It can lead to big damage combos, highly confusing mix-ups and resets, and it can also get your point character out if they're low on health. Speaking of health, Marvel Infinite incorporates the red health system found in other Capcom vs. titles. By taking damage, part of your health bar turns red, and this recovers when you tag out. Like in Street Fighter X Tekken version 2013, throws will remove this red health, so landing a grab can provide you with a big advantage if your opponent has lots of red health. In general, this may sound weird, but I would describe Marvel Infinite as feeling very light and floaty, if that makes sense. Characters are very mobile and they can move around quickly, so if you aren't playing a big body like Hulk, you'll generally be able to fly, teleport, double jump, etc. all over the place. The major gameplay hook I haven't covered yet, however, are the Infinity Stones. Before a match begins, you can choose from one of 6 Infinity Stones for you to use in battle, and by pressing L1, you can use your chosen stone, and they all do different things. The Space Stone pulls the enemy towards you, Power Stone performs a high damage wall bounce, the Time Stone makes you teleport forwards, etc., so you can use the one that fits your playstyle the most. When this meter is filled at least halfway, you can activate Infinity Storm, and this also depends on what stone you choose. The Infinity Stones can be compared to something like Capcom vs SNK 2's Groove system, as it allows players to choose a style of play that can impact how they go about performing in a match. Speaking of ways to play, in typical Marvel vs Capcom fashion, there are different character archetypes represented throughout the roster. Wait, did I say archetypes? Sorry, I meant to say functions. Obviously, there are no X-Men or Fantastic Four related characters in Infinite due to licensing issues, which is a major shame. But I suppose Captain Marvel functions similarly to Magneto? Look, either way, Marvel Infinite has a complete set of free-form mechanics, and while it does sacrifice legacy mechanics like the 6-button layout and the assists, at least they tried something new for the game and didn't try to rehash Marvel 3. Now, this isn't the most popular talking point when discovering Marvel Infinite, but I wanted to go over the game's content. After all, I paid $80 for this game on launch, so I should be getting my money's worth when it comes to the amount of modes present. To begin, we have the story mode I mentioned earlier. It's around 2 to 3 hours long, and while I'm glad they tried to introduce some legitimate story content into the Marvel vs Capcom series, this mode largely falls flat due to its mediocre writing and pretty cringeworthy moments.
Yo, Dante! Out of ammo. Can the ladies come out to play?
For you, Rocket, anything.
Next up is arcade mode, and look, it's pretty simple and you most likely already know the drill. You pick a team and you fight enemies until you reach the final boss, this weird looking thing called Ultron Omega. The best way for me to describe this is that it's like Galactus at home. It has lots of health, does big damage to you, and it can disappear to summon in minions whenever it wants, forcing you to waste time fighting a generic NPC before the boss comes back. The game also has mission mode, which contains 10 combo trials for each character, like Marvel 3, and it also includes the game's tutorial mode. Marvel Infinite is the only game in the series to have a tutorial, and it does a good job of explaining the game mechanics and the controls to newer players. It's not on the levels of something like Killer Instinct or Under Night In-Birth, but yeah, it gets the job done. Versus mode is next, and this is self-explanatory. You can choose to fight against the CPU or against another person, and finally, there's collection mode, where you can view bonus content like story mode cutscenes and concept artwork. Marvel Infinite also has online play, obviously, and what's interesting to note is that the game has rollback netcode. Playing with other people in my country works nearly flawlessly, and it's a lot better than the netcode in Marvel 3. There are ranked matches, casual matches, a lobby system, and a beginner's league, which is essentially ranked match, but it's only usable by new players who have low ranks. I really like the idea of the beginner's league, because in theory, it ensures that new players will be fighting players off their skill level, and they can comfortably play the game online without having to run into some hardcore player who labs Black Widow for 16 hours a day. When it released, Marvel Infinite received mixed to positive reviews. Despite what you may think, the game didn't end up with any negative reviews from major outlets, which is pretty surprising. The game's PS4 version has a 72 on Metacritic, while the Xbox One version has a 77, which is an interesting difference, and I'm not sure why this is the case, to be honest. Reviewers agreed that while the fighting mechanics and free-form nature of the game was very fun, the lackluster graphics and presentation and lack of classic X-Men characters soured the game for some. My research for this video included reading reviews from when the game came out, and I stumbled across this captivating, interesting quote from GameSpot. It's unfortunate then, that Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite is really let down by its presentation. Much has been made of the visuals, and while it looks much better in motion than it does in images, overall it's inconsistent and severely lacking in pizzazz. While characters like Captain Marvel, Thanos, Jeddah, and Gamora look vibrant and detailed, the likes of Dante, Frank West, Ryu, and Spencer aren't exactly easy on the eyes. The faces of the human characters specifically are very rough, ranging from vacant looking to downright ugly in poor old Frank's case. Infinite swaps out the last game's comic book style for something a little bit more realistic, which only serves to make the disparity between character models more pronounced. It's a shame, because the different arenas fights take place in are a very cool mashup of Marvel and Capcom locales. Capcom has put thought into how it can bring the two universes together and been successful. AIM has been combined with Umbrella to form Aimbrella, Asgard with Able City from Mega Man to make X-Guard, and Monster Hunter's Valhalla and Black Panther's Wakanda for Valkanda. The menus in Infinite also leave a lot to be desired. They're a very workmanlike implementation of dreary-looking text on plain backgrounds, jarringly transitioning between each other, so moving around the game's user interface feels dull and lifeless. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 felt like a celebration of the two universes. It's a game bursting with reverence for source material. Its start screen literally screams the name of the game at you like that kid opening a Nintendo 64 on Christmas morning. It plays bouncing beats in the backgrounds. Its character select is a comic book that you flip through, and everyone makes references to existing relationships or obscure storylines before battle. By comparison, Infinite is bereft of enthusiasm. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is that person at a convention wearing an elaborate Dormammu outfit complete with a flaming head. Infinite is that person wearing a plain t-shirt with the Marvel logo on it. I'm sure that after hearing that extensive quote, you figured out that the reviewers pretty much hated the presentation style of Marvel Infinite. The game's general aesthetics are trying really hard to emulate that of the MCU instead of trying to replicate the style of a comic book, and I think everyone can agree that it ends up falling flat. Fans felt the same way, as while the game had a brief stint in major tournaments, usually as a side game, its lack of competitive popularity hurt its credibility as a major fighting game. Hell, the game never even made it to EVO as a main title, meaning that for the first time since 2000, Marvel vs. Capcom will not be featured as a main game at EVO. We know MVCI was on a slippery slope and it had a lot of competition going forward, and it just kind of fizzled. It's not to talk smack on Marvel or anything, it's always been a great game for EVO, and it's had a stoic 15 years at EVO. It was the main game for 8 straight years, it was crazy, but I don't think people are playing it, and that's the problem. We've always had to support games that people actually play. Overall, Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite is a very divisive game. While some love it for its new gameplay mechanics and character roster focused on modern Marvel characters, others dislike the game for these very reasons. While I personally think that it's the quote-unquote worst Marvel vs. Capcom game, I still don't think it's a bad game. The presentation and music of Infinite don't get close to reaching the high standards of the previous game's set, but I believe that it's still a competently made game with some fun mechanics. I mentioned this during the intro, but Marvel Infinite underperformed in terms of sales, and I can't imagine that Capcom was too pleased with the mixed reviews either. I really hope that one day we'll get a brand new 3v3 Marvel vs. Capcom game with the return of assists and the X-Men, but this is just a pipe dream of mine. One thing I'd like to say before we conclude though, is that Infinite, to me at least, represents the end of a cycle of sorts. Marvel Infinite was directed by Norio Hirose, one of the lead programmers on the very first Marvel vs. Capcom game way back in 1998. As a side note, I know that X-Men vs Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter are technically Marvel vs Capcom games, but Clash of Superheroes was the first time the phrase Marvel vs Capcom was ever used. So having someone who worked pretty heavily on the first game return to direct the final game in the series is somewhat poetic, I feel. All in all, if you can get a few friends around and you don't mind the game's visuals and audio, then yeah, it's a blast. But if you want to get serious with the series, I'd recommend learning Ultimate Marvel vs Capcom 3.